What's the great appeal of a heist story? Colson Whitehead joins us to talk about his new novel, Harlem Shuffle. Why write a novel about the novelist Thomas Mann? Column Toibin will be here to talk about The Magician. Alexandra Alter will tell us what's new in publishing news. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's September 17th. I'm Pamela Paul. Colson Whitehead joins us now from Manhattan. His latest novel is Harlem Shuffle. Welcome back to the podcast, Colson.
Glad to be back.
I think this is your third time here.
Third time's a charm. The other ones were so disastrous.
That's right. We'll fix things. Well, this is actually a really different novel from the two most recent ones that you're coming off of. It is, like the other two, I guess you would call it historical. The Underground Railroad, of course, you jump around in time, but you start in the 19th century. With the Nickel Boys, you are into the 20th century. And then in this book, Harlem Shuffle, you're in the 1960s. Were you consciously moving forward in time, continuing in this vein of historical fiction?
No, I mean, in 2004, I had basically all my good ideas for books. So I'm still living off them.
You have a list somewhere?
Yeah, it's getting shorter. But that was the year I decided to commit to the Underground Railroad. I had the idea years before, but I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I've been putting it off. But that summer, I came across the story of the Dozier School, which became the model for the Nickel Boys, and thought, that there's a book in there probably. And around that time, I was staring off into space, as I often do, and was thinking about how much I love Ocean's 11 and heist movies. Could I do a heist novel? When I actually got around to writing it, I was not going to write a heist novel in 1850 So I picked the 60s and had a great time doing it.
What was going on in your life in 2004 that made this such a fertile moment?
I had written fiction for 4 years. I was teaching a lot, paying the bills. There's some folks who can teach and write at the same time. I can't. So I only had summers, or I would take a bunch of classes in the spring so I could have the fall free. And so I think I was at one of those points where you have to make a change in your life, career. The Noble Hustle came out, and I think it's a superb book. It's my book about the World Series of Poker. But no one particularly was interested. And I just remember being walking around that fall, I was teaching with very distinguished older writers who, are very famous and are still coming into the office. And I was just like, you just keep doing this till you die? Just keep writing books? It's so depressing. Can I just retire at some point? And so I was in this whole existential thing. Should I go to cooking school? And then I snapped out of it because I knew there's nothing else I could do but start working. So I got back to work on Underground. But I think I was looking for a way out of a career rut. What do I do next? Keep
writing until you die. Who are those other older professors?
Well, one of them passed on, and that's what he did. He kept writing until I don't know. I assume that's what I'll do too, but it just seems so... not more decades of this, just coming up with ideas and then trying not to screw them up. There's a lot of pressure.
Well, this is a fun book. And
sorry, did I go too dark there?
Yeah, you went too dark. But it's certainly less dark than the Nickel Boys and Underground Railroad. I mean, did that feel like a conscious break of I just need to escape?
I usually do a lighter book than a heavier book, but I felt compelled to write the Nickel Boys at the time that I did. So I knew that, the crime genre, there's more room for jokes. 100 years into the genre, whether you're talking about books or movies, there's just a lot more room for play. So I knew that I could exercise my humor muscle again. And then immediately Carney, I wanted him to win. As soon as he appeared on the page, he was someone who was not as determined by his circumstances, slavery, Jim Crow, as the characters in those previous two novels. And he pulls off some capers, and I think at least I was rooting for him. So immediately the tone was different, and I gave myself to it.
I don't know if the sirens are going to come through in this audio recording, but they feel right now very atmospheric. I'm leaning towards keeping them. Let's talk about Carney. Who is he, your main character here?
Yeah, he is, to all appearances, an upstanding member of the community. He has a furniture store on 125th and Morningside. He grew up with a crook for a dad, so that was his example of manhood, but he's gone the other way, put himself through college, grad school, started a family. Except there is the call of his nature, his sort of crooked blood. His father's handed down this heirloom to him, and the idea for the book was to write a heist book, and then quickly, as I came up with more and more capers for Carney to get involved in, it became a portrait of this character who's divided between his straight, normalized self and lifestyle, and then his crooked lifestyle.
I want to talk all about the appeal of heist novels and heist movies, but that figure of the reluctant crook appears in many of them. What's the appeal?
On paper, all these heists are bad ideas. You should really just stick to what society is telling you to do. And Carney has a cousin. They're about the same age. And when they were little, his cousin Freddie would always like urge on the mischief, and they would get to hijinks together. And then it's less attractive as you get older. But there's still that way that Carney wants to be bad. There are a few different types of heists. They're the ones that are successful, like Ocean's 11, and then the ones I sort of like more are the ones from the 50s and 60s and 70s movies. Asphalt Jungle, The Killing, the French ones, Rififi, The Red Circle. And then there are a lot of like early 70s low technology ones like Charlie Varick, The Taking of Pelham 123, where you don't get to buy $1 million electric magnetic pulse generator as they do in Ocean's 11 and knock out all the security cameras. You have to do it by hand. And there's something about the craftsmanship that I adore. I do a lot of outlining for my novels, trying to get all the details right. And then I execute and hopefully don't mess it up. And then going back to my poker book, you know, gamblers are animated by this idea that the next hand will change their fates. If they get that full house, royal flush, all the miserableness of their existence will be erased by this big hand and the money. And of course, even if they get it, they'll be gambling it all away the next day. And I think the heisters too believe that they can outwit destiny if they pull off this one last job. And of course, things go wrong because you're not just one person; you're with a crew. And the more people you get in, the more human frailty comes into the mix.
I have to digress, take up a tangent that you just raised because you mentioned a movie that I absolutely love, The Taking of Pelham 123, and just rewatched this summer for probably the fourth or fifth time. And it's interesting watching that movie and then attempting to watch, and it's like really, really hard to, the remake, because everything that's good about that movie and about the kind of heist in that movie, they seem to forget how to do in the second, or to do the absolute opposite.
The remake is terrible. And then, I was a kid growing up in New York when I first saw it, and there's this parade of great New York types. Everyone is cranky, everyone is snapping on each other. If you hijack a subway car, as they do in the book, you get 25 different New York freaks, and they're all just trying to survive. They're abusing each other, and then there's also men with guns. And then it's Walter Matthau, who crazily was about my age when he did that movie. People aged differently back then, but he works for the transit cops in that one, and he's a movie 2 years earlier called Charlie Varick, where he's a bank robber. So I really love this Walter Matthau early 70s moment where he's doing these crime movies, and he's sort of disheveled and grumpy and just sort of shuffling through, and hopefully that comes through. And some of my characters like Pepper, who is this seasoned criminal in the Harlem Shuffle, who's seen it all and is just trying to execute the plan without these fools screwing it up for him.
One of the other things I loved about that movie is how low the stakes were. Like, I mean, not in terms of human lives, but I think the money that like the ransom is something like silly, like $100,000 or something, and like uttered with such drama. What are the stakes in Harlem Shuffle?
Well, there are a few, capers. As I said, kept coming up with different jobs that Corny could do, so it became a triptych, sort of, and I see it as like three novellas that come together, Voltron style, to make a novel, and shown at different points in these years. So there's surviving. He gets inducted into this heist, and it's definitely above his pay grade. So can he survive? And then there's a revenge caper where he gives into his dark side and decides he needs some payback for a social wrong. And then, I won't describe the third one, but in each one, I think Carney has to face what kind of man he is. Is he that humble store owner, or is he like his father and giving into that darkness that's within him? And I think all of us have that self we are when we're alone, when we're with friends, with family, at work, and we juggle those different personas. And sometimes those poses, personalities aren't so starkly different, and then sometimes they are. And definitely in the case of Carney, particularly in the middle of the book, he's one person at midnight as he comes up with these schemes, and one person at noon in his store.
You described him coming up with these ideas for these heists and the fact that heists are generally always a bad idea. What's the process for you of coming up with the ideas of what is the heist going to be? Does that come naturally? Was it hard to think of what the scheme was?
It's hard to actually execute them. I have to make this hotel heist convincing for the reader and nitpickers and whoever's going to write in saying like, no, actually, safe deposit boxes in 1964 had a secret latch that prevented you from opening them in this way. So I have to be thorough. Luckily, I have an editor who's like he really is nitpicky. So I know if there's a hole, hopefully he'll pick it up.
Another fact check, I imagine, for you could come from your parents, right? Because they grew up in central Harlem in the 1960s.
Yes, my mom. So I started researching, and I found the Hotel Teresa, and that's the place that gets robbed. On the first floor, it was a chock full of nuts. There are a lot of famous, I don't know if they're famous, but a lot of photographs of like Castro campaigning in front of the chock full of nuts, trying to get American support. Muhammad Ali surrounded by fans, and so I wrote the first couple of chapters, and I told my mom, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I used to eat at that chock full of nuts all the time. I worked around the corner." And so I should have just been asking her. I wrote some more and then got back to her, and she was like, "Oh yeah, Blumstein's. Your dad worked there for 2 summers," and I'd already inserted Carney as a stock boy there, so it was just sort of weird. But she has not read the book yet. I gave her a copy 2 weeks ago, and she's like, "I just read ebooks now." So
Oh,
wait.
what a slap.
Just like her eyes, her failing eyes, and you can make the print like a foot long. So, but definitely, I was trying to figure out what apartments did young families move into, or what was the hip apartment complex. And so, in later sections, some of the places where the characters live are supplied by my mother.
All right. Other than your mother, what was your research for this book like? What did you do?
A lot of it from the fine establishment of the New York Times archive. So it takes place in 59, 61, and
I'm sure you saw
64.
some like really unpleasant things in there in terms of how we reported on Harlem at that time.
Surely, you're not alone. Like in 61, it was Robert Wagner was running for mayor again, and that's a subplot. So when I go to the archive, on one page is, the Tammany Hall bosses give their nod to Robert Wagner. On one page, and the opposite is like a big ad for Siemens furniture, with the atomic jet age sleek lines and the champagne finish on the wood. And so I would steal the language from the newspaper reports and then like the ads. So that was one thing. If you have any kind of interest, it's on the internet now. Like some weirdo has put up their particular fetish interest. So if you just go to Pinterest and put in, 60s furniture, someone has put a catalog for Sears furniture from 1962, and all 8 pages. And I said for someone like me who is always sort of just grabbing slang and words and vocabulary from first person sources, that's great. YouTube, amateur photographers from the 60s, they're either, their kids or grandkids put up grandpa's 8 millimeter footage of walking down Harlem, 125th Street, and that's there. And I can pull prices of food. What are they wearing? What kind of hat is that? What kind of car is that? And then put them in and hopefully weave them in successfully. And then there are memoirs. Bumpy Johnson was a Harlem gangster. I couldn't put him in because he was in Alcatraz in 61. But his wife, to correct the record, told his side of things. and she explains how numbers rackets work and where you dump a body if you want to get rid of it, where you dump a body if you want them to live. If you want someone to live, you beat them up and then drop them in front of Harlem Hospital and speed off. If you've killed them, you dump them in Mount Morris, now Marcus Garvey Park, and creep away. And then even one last example, but William Burroughs has a book called Junkie. It's about being a hustler and heroin addict in New York and the South in the 50s and 40s. And I read it in college, and I remember just how he would describe 103rd Street, which is where I grew up, as this hub of heroin traffic, because like city workers would come from downtown, get off at the 103rd Street station, score, and then head back downtown. And he's just a lot of great criminal slang. So memoirs, newspapers, and furniture pamphlets.
You're not a Patrick Modiano, where you're sort of consistently working in the same register and the same themes and like often the variation on the same story, book after book after book. I mean, you've done speculative historical fiction, coming of age, zombie novels, straight historical fiction, a heist book. In your mind, is there something that makes each of your books a Colson Whitehead novel?
Well, for me, there's a hook of an idea that gets in and keeps insisting on itself. So what if the Underground Railroad was a real train? And then 14 years later, I was like, I keep coming back to this idea. It sounds cool. So I read a newspaper report or I'm watching TV. I'm like, there's maybe a book in that 2020 story. And it stays with me and keeps growing and germinating. So I think there's that. I keep coming back to certain themes, the city, American history, technology, although not lately. Humor, if I can get some weird jokes in, I'm pretty happy. So there's not one thing, but there's a handful of themes I keep returning to, and then they're not all in the same book, but they've definitely been recurring.
So we were talking about heist stories in the beginning. We're talking about books and also, of course, movies. And I imagine it's hard to think about a heist book without maybe thinking, what would this be like on screen? And this book was written, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, after the Underground Railroad was optioned for TV and then adapted as a series. Did that experience infiltrate your writing? Do you see things possibly as adaptations now?
Some books more readily I can see as film or TV, like even before Underground Railroad. Like The Intuitionist borrows a lot from film noir. It's very lean. There's a detective plot in it. Sag Harbor, it has been optioned, but I don't really see how it works. So good luck with it. So, I finished it before I'd seen Underground Railroad, so it was very abstract, even though I had good faith in it. So I don't think about TV when I'm writing. And with this book, there has been some interest, but I'm now doing a second book about Carney in the 1970s. And it's just been such a real great experience to not be done with the book after a year and a half and just stay with the characters, stay with the world, that I don't want people asking me like, where does Carney end up? Or what's his motivation? I sort of want to keep it in this very selfish way to myself. So I don't want to be bothered by people. I just want to keep it as mine. So if people are still interested after when I'm done with with the next book, that's fine. But it is a book for me, and I have no idea how to do it for a series.
Well, now it's a book for everyone else.
Yes.
Colson, thanks for being here.
Sure. Take care. Stay safe, folks.
Colson Whitehead's latest novel is called Harlem Shuffle. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I'm going to bring you one of my favorite historical stories. It's from 1912. After the sinking of the Titanic, Thomas Hardy wrote a poem called The Convergence of the Twain, which appeared on the front page of the paper. And here's the op-ed which appeared a few days later. If the hundreds and hundreds of people who have sent us verses about the loss of the Titanic will read with care those which Thomas Hardy has written about it, they may be moved to share our own wonderment at the audacity they showed in attempting to deal with such a subject. For very few of those hundreds and hundreds of people had any other excuse for trying to write other than the fact that the great disaster had excited in them strong feelings of sympathy and horror. They all took it for granted that being thus moved, their verses would give poetical expression to their emotions. And evidently they did not even suspect that the wreck, instead of lending itself so readily to poetic treatment that anyone could make a poem out of it, was in reality material of a kind to daunt poets of high ability and long experience. And at that point, the op-ed went on to actually ding the Hardy poem and point out that the Hardy poem was so terrible that, quote, instead of adding to his reputation, it has decreased it. I know. And on and on and on, pointing out the faults of the poem are a particular hardness, the frequent appearance of utterly prosaic phrases, and the fact that the reader feels as if the words had been found with difficulty and forced into place by something like hydraulic pressure. One is tempted to call this the worst poem that the Titanic has prompted, but that would not be true, for it really is poetry of a sort, and therefore better than, or not as bad as, most of that which has been written and sent to us since the ship went down. Produced by a man of talent with at least a flash of genius now and then, it's worth reading and study, but it ought to serve as a dreadful warning for amateur poets.
Was there like a pun about sinking a poet's career in there somewhere?
No, but there certainly should be. Okay, I love everything about this story. I love the Times criticism of the poem itself, but I also love the fact that hundreds of people wrote their own poems and sent them in.
Those were more poetical times, as the Times writer of that piece might phrase it.
I think so.
All right. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Colm Toibin joins us from Los Angeles. His new novel is called The Magician. Colm, thanks so much for being here.
Good morning.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about this novel.
It covers the life of the German novelist Thomas Mann, who was born in 1875 and died in 1955. He lived in a way through the long 20th century, through the First World War, the Munich Revolution, the rise of Hitler, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And, during all that time, he was, in a way, engaged with his work so seriously. But also, of course, politics intervened. History intervened. We discovered after his death in his diaries that he thought about sex quite a lot, and it was always young men. So that Death in Venice is not merely an exercise in writing about beauty. It was something that mattered to him enormously. But he also was married and had 6 children. And he was married to a very clever woman, and some of his children were very talented people. So he's a figure, I think, because he was so committed to his work and then became involved politically almost despite himself, that he's in sort of an ambiguous figure. He's quite hard to pin down.
People will hear your name and they'll hear the title, The Magician, and they're going to automatically think of one of your earlier novels, although you've written other novels since then, which was The Master, about Henry James. So this is obviously not the first time you've entered into the world and mind of an established novelist. What's the draw there? And maybe just tell us a little bit about that earlier book.
The Master is a novel about Henry James. I suppose it's a smaller canvas in a way, because he really wasn't involved, Henry James, in wars. He dies in 1916 and he didn't have 6 children, so that it's much more a book about someone's solitude, someone who's haunted. But it is the same idea that you take a figure about whom a great amount has been written, but who remains for me ambiguous or hard to pin down or shadowy. And you attempt then not to remove the shadows and find substance, but to work constantly with the shadows, to mold the shadows and find a texture within them over a life that is, I think, mysterious still, the life of Henry James, or the figure that he was, or the gaps or distances in him between one thing and another. If you say one thing about him, the opposite is often true. So I explored that in The Master. And then I think 16 years later, I have another figure of the same sort. I should say I don't have a third, but these are 2 figures whose work I have been reading since I was in my late teens, and then who, both of them, I think, our views of them changed in the 1980s as more and more information became available about them, as other books were published, as some of Henry James's letters appeared. for the first time in the 80s and 90s, and indeed when Thomas Mann's diaries were published 25 years after his death.
Both of them obviously had one thing in common, more than one thing, I'm sure, but one major thing, which is that they were both, of course, gay and deeply closeted. Was that part of the mystery that you think intrigued you, that you spoke about earlier, that you mentioned?
Yes, I think how they navigate this or how they don't, the amount of revelation and concealment, sometimes both at the same moment in their works, interested me. But that wouldn't be enough for me. In other words, Oscar Wilde was gay, but I couldn't think of writing a novel about him. What interests me about both of these figures also is their relationship to home or native country. In other words, that James, very early in his life, his father moves the family to Europe, back and forth to Europe, back and forth to New England, so that by the time he arrives to live in England, when he's in his 30s, he really has no home. And there's a constant sense of trying to find one, trying to go to Lamb House in Rye in Sussex in England and set up a home there. But of course, he was solitary. He was a bachelor. So there's always an uneasy sort of flickering relationship to home. And Thomas Mann in 1933 was outside Germany when Hitler came to power, and he didn't come back in. He was warned not to. And so he goes to Switzerland, to France, and then eventually arrives in Princeton in 1938, and then eventually to California in 1941. And so he spends the war years outside Germany, thinking of Germany, sort of living in the language, writing his novel Dr. Faustus, but actually not setting foot in the country again until the war was well over, until 1949.
Were the motivations for entering into this second novel about a novelist different in some ways? Did you feel like you were working on a similar and related project when you did this, or did this feel to you completely different from that earlier book?
Yes, it's a very different book because with Henry James, I was dealing all the time with his solitude, with his dream life, with what he was imagining, so that it was really a book about a solitary figure. With Thomas Mann, you can't do that. I mean, he has 6 children, and each of them is very different from the other. He had a very intelligent and serious-minded wife, and also he experienced public events in ways that really mattered to him in a way that Henry James didn't. So that, it's a way of trying to keep the novel intimate while also register very large events like the First World War, like the rise of Hitler, where you have to concentrate not on these events as public events, but as public events that mattered in the private life of Thomas Mann, what it was like to be in his house or in his mind as the First World War broke out. So that this is a much more, I suppose, public book. Mann makes very little noise in this book. He tends to be a silent figure. He's watchful. He's uneasy. It's his children make all the noise and his wife. So that he's in his study and he leaves his study. And immediately he's in a large house of noisy, opinionated people. And so there's a great deal of dialogue in the book, but it's not dialogue that he takes part in. He's listening. He's involved. He's always ready to go back to his study. So it's a much more social book than the Henry James book.
Is that who he was? Do we know that about him as a person, that he kept to himself and was the retiring type?
You see, we have his diaries and we can tell, and we also have the letters. We also have a memoir written by his wife in her 90s. We have a memoir by his son, Golo. We have a memoir by his son, Klaus, so that we have a memoir by his daughter, Monica. So we have a great deal of information about the magician, as they called him. In other words, regularly every morning he went to his study. Between about the hours of about 9 a.m. and lunchtime, he worked on either on his fiction or on essays. And this was almost religious ritual. No one disturbed him during these hours. He didn't have a large group of friends. He tended to stay in the domestic sphere. Yes, he could be silent. He could be withdrawn. There were years in the children's lives, especially when their mother was in a sanatorium, where they found him distant and irascible. And some of them did not have happy memories of him as a father. So he could be a severe and distant person. But then the opposite could also be the case. He would do magic tricks for the children. And he particularly had very good relationships with his daughter, Erica, and his daughter, Elizabeth, not so much with the sons.
Tell us a little bit about his wife, Katya. She was from a prominent Jewish family in Munich.
One of the problems I had with the book is, how do you deal with the marriage of a gay man to a woman? And one of the problems would be, the cliche would be to make her into a long-suffering figure, who's sort of emotionally abandoned by her husband, whose marriage is a mistake. But that wasn't the case with the Manns. I suppose we have to imagine that this marriage took place in 1905. She was a very liberated person, Cathy. She was studying science at university. Her grandmother was the most important German feminist. Her family was tremendously rich, tremendously bohemian, and tremendously civilized. In her early 20s, she threw in her lot with this famous novelist because he was famous at 25, having written his novel Buddenbrooks. She knew what she was letting herself in for. And one of the happy parts was he never looked at another woman in all the years. She, I think, was cleverer than he was. I think more politically astute than he was. I think that the marriage, oddly enough, ended being happy and fulfilled, strangely.
And she knew he was gay.
There's a moment in her book called Unwritten Memories where she describes being in Venice with him in 1911, just before he wrote Death in Venice. And yes, she said, yes, Tommy did look at this boy, this beautiful boy on the beach. Yes, I do remember that. He didn't follow him in the streets, but he did look at him all the time. He was intrigued by his beauty.
And that we take as a real acknowledgement.
Oh, I don't think she was in any doubt. But if she was in doubt, his diaries were published 25 years after his death, when she was still alive. And his diaries, I think German scholars, people working on his fiction, were pretty surprised when his diaries were opened, published in 1980, to find that he, explicit accounts of his desires. And he would be at a reading, he would be on the podium, he would be talking about the most serious matters in German literature, about Goethe or Beethoven or Wagner, but actually what he was thinking would be a boy in the second row or a young man in the third row whose eye he would catch, and his gaze. I think Thomas Mann's gaze was particularly intense. We learned that from the diaries. And so this most respectable man, a visitor in the White House, friend of Roosevelt, considered the most important German alive during the Second World War, a great Democrat, a great believer in freedom, a great enemy of Hitler and fascism, had a secret life, a life of secret desires.
Let's talk about Buddenbrooks, which, he wrote when he was 25, which is still upsetting and shocking in a way that someone could produce something like that so young. To what extent was it autobiographical, and was it deliberately autobiographical?
He had lost Lübeck, where he was born, in the north of Germany. His family was a well-known family. They owned ships, they owned warehouses. His father was a senator. His father dies when he's 14, and in his will says that the entire company is to be wound up. And his mother leaves Lübeck to go to Munich. So in other words, by the age of 16 or 17, Thomas Mann has lost his important place in this city. In other words, they owned a number of houses. Everyone knew him on the street, and suddenly he's nobody. Now, this is a great gift to a writer in a way, where now, in his early 20s, he begins to reconstruct that world that is completely obliterated. And he goes back 3 generations. He writes about his great-grandfather. He writes about the sort of strange decline of this great commercial family. And what he does with his own generation is, although he's one of a family of 5, he makes himself an only child, and he gives himself an extraordinary, precocious musical talent. And instead of his mother being Brazilian, which his mother was born in Brazil, he makes his mother exotic also, but coming from Amsterdam rather than Brazil. He changes that. And he also, in the novel, of course, he kills himself. He gives Hanno a fatal disease, so that we watch the actual death of the author, imagining his own death as a young teenager.
What do you think that's about?
Oh, I think it's all about an interest he always had in decay and decline. And it would go right through his work into The Magic Mountain, where he writes about illness, into Death in Venice, where he writes about sugary beauty and cholera, and indeed into Dr. Faustus, where he writes about he writes about syphilis. But this was something that preoccupied him. It may have been a metaphor for what he saw as something happening to Europe or to society. But the metaphor part is less important in something like Buddenbrooks than the strange realism of the book, the strange way in which rooms are described, in which characters are developed over decades, in which the whole idea of generation to generation, of capital moving from one father to son, and this, of course, then stopping with the death of young Hanno, who has been taken over by culture rather than commerce.
And then in The Magic Mountain, he seems to then extend that to a much larger and more political scale, in that people read it often as a book about the decline of Europe.
Yes, but it's fascinating how it begins in intimacy. Thomas Mann's wife was diagnosed as having tuberculosis, and she went to Davos, and she was in that particular clinic in Davos, and he went, as Hans Castorp does in the novel, he went to visit her. And so he spent that time. The novel is particularly vivid about the early weeks of Hans Castorp's visit to the sanatorium, where he's getting used to the rituals and he's getting used to the who is in the next room or who is everywhere else. And so from that intimate visit, just to see his wife, he made this panorama where the entire future of Europe is in some way both dramatized and debated in the book. He began the book before the First World War. He abandoned it during the war, where he wrote, I think, a ridiculously bad book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which is his effort to write sort of political philosophy, which he really fails. And then he takes the book up again after the war, so that it has that sense of European disruption, of the fact that Europe is not a settled place as it might have seemed to anyone looking at it in, say, 1910 or 1911, that by the time he takes the book up again in 1919, say, realizing that Europe is still up for grabs or up for debate. And so the novel becomes, I think, a crucial intervention by an artist in that debate.
Can you touch for a moment on that book, Reflections of a Non-Political Man, and what makes it ridiculous? It was just republished this year.
It's really worth reading just to see what often a very good novelist trying to intervene politically often should stick to the day job and write novels and stories. You know, he didn't have a great education. He didn't go to university. He tended, if he was writing an essay, to read all the things he needed to read for that essay, but not know anything more than was in the essay. His wife pointed this out at one stage to people. Don't ask him anything because he doesn't really know more than is in the essay. Attempting to write sort of theoretically and abstractly about what it meant to be German from a particularly paranoid position, which he began to maintain in 1914, believing that Germany was surrounded by its enemies, believing that Germany was special, that Germany had a relationship to culture, which France didn't have or England didn't have. And he used a fellow who did know much more than he did, called Ernest Bertram, who became a Nazi later on and oversaw things like the burning of the books. And Bertram came to the house every day, much to the consternation of Thomas Mann's wife, Cathy, who just didn't like him. But he became close enough to the family that he was godfather to Thomas Mann's daughter, Elizabeth. Bertram really had read his Nietzsche, really knew his German philosophy. And Bertram is almost a co-author of that book. And Bertram was more openly homosexual than Thomas Mann, but there was never a sexual relationship between them. It was much more that if Thomas Mann had an idea, Bertram could give him a quote, could tell him what book to look at. This happened much later on with Theodor Adorno when he was writing Dr. Faustus. He was very good magpie in that sense. Like a lot of novelists, he was very good magpie. Rather than being a philosopher or a serious thinker, he was very good at sort of finding what he needed and moving on to the next thing. But in that book, I think it really shows.
Well, presumably he moved on politically.
That's amazing what happened. And I think from my point of view, you have to be very careful with. He was really fired up in August, September, October 1914. He was really fired up for blood, for military activity, for German victory. It's really strange watching this man who's otherwise rational, who's oddly apolitical, becoming mad in these months. And you have to remember, this is what happened in England with war fever. It happened even slightly in Ireland. And on the other side, it happened in Germany, and he was part of it. By 1920, he's cured. By about 1922 or 23, he has become a Democrat, and he's become, I think, a much more centrist, conformist figure. And of course, being centrist and conformist in Germany in the 1920s is no use. But nonetheless, he becomes an implacable enemy of Hitler.
In fictionalizing a real person's life and turning it into a novel, how beholden did you feel to the known historical record?
As much as possible, I follow the facts. In other words, if I say he's in Munich, he's in Munich. If I say he went somewhere, in general, he went there. If I say he's having these feelings early in the war in 1914, 1915, he is having these feelings. So I'm following the contours. But what I'm trying to do is enter into his spirit. A biographer would tell the story from without. In other words, would offer you the information based on all the sources, and you are reading about him. What I'm attempting to do is enter into his spirit so that you are seeing the world from his perspective. So that it's a book, I suppose, that deals with spirit or the inner self or the interior life of somebody in the same way as a figure in a novel you might deal with So that what I'm, I suppose, working with is the emotional life, but not just the emotional life of Thomas Mann, but the emotional life of the reader as the reader reads the book. I'm attempting to get you to feel what is happening in a scene. And so I'm working as much with rhythms of sentences or with way images are presented in order to give you something that might hit your nervous system before it is entertained by your intelligence.
Was there a moment for you in the process of researching or even writing in which you felt, I get it, I know this person, I can inhabit him as a character?
No, I think you'd want to be arrogant to say that you could know someone like Thomas Mann, this very complex figure. So I was always sure that that wouldn't be possible. What I would do is I would find images to suggest a way of seeing him or to suggest a way that he was seeing the world. So it's not an attempt to pin him down so that by the end of the book you really know him. I'm as interested in his unknowability as I am in attempting to draw a very clear portrait of him. I think it's an important question. I mean, I often hear novelists saying, I felt I really knew my character. And I often feel the opposite. I often feel my character has become even more evasive the further attempts I have made to enter their spirit.
Does that kind of prod you on, keep you
Oh, yeah.
motivated, keep you
Oh, it
interested?
absolutely does. But early on in the process in 2005, I mean, I've been thinking about this book for a long time. I got access to the house that Thomas Mann built in Pacific Palisades, which is where the book, this novel, The Magician, was launched, because the German government now owns that building that Thomas Mann had designed in 1942. And I saw his study, and I saw his study later that he had in Princeton. They were very like each other, slightly away from the domestic parts of the house, shadowy, with bookshelves, with a desk that he brought from Munich, that he brought to America with him. I got a sense of how writers live in language, and he said this, he lived in the German language, that he brought the language with him, and that every day, in this religious way, he went into his study and he remade the world in the middle of California with his palm trees and extraordinary beautiful light. He moved into a shadowy room and he entertained his shadows.
When did you first encounter Thomas Mann as a reader?
I was 18 or 19, and it's hard to imagine, but at that time, I'm talking about 1972 or 73, The Magic Mountain was a book that every student was reading. I mean, it was maybe the David Foster Wallace of that time. In the same way as you would go to Ingmar Bergman films, you would have the big paperback of The Magic Mountain. And I certainly read Death in Venice. You see, the movie of Death in Venice was a big deal at the time as well, in the early 70s. The book that really affected me, I think, was Dr. Faustus. The whole idea of attempting to, I suppose, investigate the ambiguous nature of German culture, how German musical culture was not merely about liberation of the spirit. It was also about creating a sort of gnarled or unsettled spirit in Germany that went two ways. It went into the creation of artists like Thomas Mann, or the delight people got in concert halls, but also stirred the spirit politically into areas that were poisonous and dangerous. And certainly that book, really, I remember vividly reading that book, and made an enormous difference to me. And of course, I loved Buddenbrooks. And in my second novel, where I'm dealing also with generations of a family, and I also come from a family of 5, I also reduced that family to 1, which is a sort of self-portrait, just getting my siblings out of the way. It's almost a sort of Freudian idea that you could actually, in a book, just imagine it was just you, and all the toys were yours, and all the sweets were yours, all the attention was on you.
One way to deal with sibling rivalry.
Yes, exactly. And he did it in Buddenbrooks, and I found it a very useful template for my novel, The Head of Blazing.
I'm going to ask just a really quick final question, because I'm sure that you've interested people not only in reading your new novel, The Magician, but also in reading Thomas Mann, if they haven't already. Where do you usually tell people to start?
Buddenbrooks.
Yeah.
It's a great 19th century blockbuster novel.
That's what I say. It's completely accessible, an engrossing family saga. Colin, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Colin Toibin's new novel, The Magician, is reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. Alexandra Alter joins us now to give us the latest in publishing news. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So, literary award season is kicking into high gear already. And I don't know about you, but I feel like it's starting earlier every year. It's like they put up the holiday decorations in Walgreens already or something. But there are a lot of interesting books that are being nominated for major awards this year. So, this week we heard about the finalists for the Booker Prize. There's 6 finalists. 3 of them are American. This has been a point of contention for several years among writers who feel like Americans have dominated the Booker Prize ever since it was open to them. But there are some also interesting authors from elsewhere. So on the Booker finalists list, we have some repeats, people who have been nominated before. For example, Richard Powers, who is shortlisted for Bewilderment. He was also shortlisted for The Overstory. Maggie Shipstead is nominated for A Great Circle. Patricia Lockwood is nominated for No One Is Talking About This, her novel, which is a bit of a meta commentary on the internet, and she's known for her poetry, so interesting to see her nominated for fiction. Nadifa Muhammad is nominated for The Fortune Men, Anouk Arud-Pragasam for A Passage North, and Damon Galgut for The Promise. Damon Galgut has been, I think this is the 3rd time he's up for the Booker, so maybe 3rd time's a charm, we'll see. But we won't find out until November 3rd when the winners will be announced at a ceremony in London. Also this week, we got the long list for the National Book Awards, and there's quite a few more books on these lists. There are 5 categories, including one for literature and translation, which I think is a great category. Even though it's the National Book Awards, it's a nice way to alert readers to literary works from other countries that might be not on our radar otherwise. So between the Booker and the National Book Awards, at this point, there's only one author on both lists, and it's Richard Powers. Richard Powers is on the long list for fiction, along with Anthony Doerr, who was a previous nominee. He is nominated for Cloud Cuckoo Land. Lauren Groff, who is also a previous nominee, I think a 2-time National Book Award finalist, is nominated for Matrix, which is her novel that's set in a nunnery in France. Jacob Guanzin is nominated for Abundance. It's a debut novel that follows a father and son after they're evicted from their trailer on New Year's Eve, and that's from Grey Wolf Press. Grey Wolf Press has had a really good showing at all kinds of literary awards for several years. They publish really interesting, experimental, and groundbreaking works. And the other fiction nominees this year are Laird Hunt for Zori, Honoré Fanann Jeffers for The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. It's her debut novel, and it's already gotten a tremendous reception, great reviews, a little bit of a boost from Oprah, and the novel traces her family across 2 centuries, starting in a small town where her ancestors lived in Georgia and were enslaved, and it's been described as a sweeping epic. There's another debut by Robert Jones Jr. called The Prophets, and this is a love story about 2 Black enslaved men in the Deep South on a plantation who find love in these unbelievably horrendous circumstances. And among the other fiction finalists, Katie Kitamura for Intimacies, Elizabeth McCracken for The Souvenir Museum, which is a story collection, and Jason Mott for Hell of a Book, which I have to confess I haven't read, but based on the description, I'm intrigued. It was inspired by his own book tour, and it fictionalizes the experience of the book tour with the story of a Black child growing up in the rural South. It's a little bit of a meta take on a book tour, which I think is always fun when you get a little bit of insidery publishing insight there.
Alexandra, that's a long, long list. How many books is that?
So there are 10 nominees in each category, and that gets winnowed down to 5 for the shortlists.
Is that the usual length?
It is. So the National Book Awards started doing these long lists, and I think part of the reasoning behind it is just to give more attention to more authors. And it does help. I think sometimes people wonder, well, what is the point of these literary awards? We have this special board of people who are anointing these authors as the best in the country. On the other hand, it really does elevate the work of authors who might have been overlooked by the public because maybe they're not on the bestseller list. Maybe they don't have the backing of one of the biggest publishing houses marketing them, putting their books at the front of Barnes & Noble. So it does really give a little more of a platform to a lot of authors who might not have otherwise gotten a large audience. And particularly when you get on the short list, and particularly when you win, that can really drive readers to your book. So I do think these awards are really increasingly important in a marketplace where the best-selling authors and the biggest publishing houses are dominating in so many ways, from what you see on Amazon when you go there to what you see in a bookstore when you go there, or a Target or a Walmart, which are increasingly places where people are encountering books. So these awards really do, I think, because they get covered in the media and then bookstores order more copies. It really is kind of a virtuous cycle. So there's a very interesting group of nonfiction authors nominated this year. They include Hanif Abdurraqib for A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance, Lucas Besser, Running Out in Search of Water on the High Plains, Grace M. Cho, Taste Like War. It's a memoir, and it's from Feminist Press. Scott Ellsworth's book, The Groundbreaking, An American City and Its Search for Justice. Nicole Eustace, Covered with Night, which is a story of murder and indigenous justice in early America. That's from Norton. Heather McGee, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, which is from One World, an imprint of Penguin Random House. Louis Manon, The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. That's from FSG. Tia Miles, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, from Random House. Clint Smith, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, from Little Brown. And Deborah Willis, The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship, from New York University Press. So as you can see, there's a lot of books about America's racial history, reckoning with that. There's books about environmental crises like the droughts and the extreme weather that we're grappling with. So often the nonfiction long list can provide kind of a snapshot of what our current concerns are. Our colleague Elizabeth Harris has a full account also of the poetry and young people's literature and the works in translation. So there's a lot of interesting books on those lists as well. You can see them all in the New York Times and elsewhere.
So when do we find out the winners?
So the finalists will be announced on October 5th, and the winners will be announced at the National Book Awards ceremony on November 17th.
All right. Thanks so much, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you. What have you been reading?
Well, I'm reading a travel memoir by really one of the great travel writers of the 20th century named Patrick Leigh Fermor. The name of this book that I'm reading is A Time of Gifts. He was a British travel writer who I had never read before. I've heard his name a lot as kind of one of the great adventure travel writers, and he was a war hero in World War II and very influential on people like Paul Theroux and subsequent travel writers. But I don't read a lot of travel writing as a genre. I'm not drawn to it somehow in my reading, maybe just because I sat through a lot of slideshows when I was a kid before people could just post like cactus photos on Facebook. And so my parents used to have this whole thing where they'd like pull out the slide carousel and like the easel with the screen on it and be like, that's a seagull. Or it might be because I have this inclination to think that travel writing will have some of the same liabilities that travel itself can have, where it can be a little dilettantish or imperial. By definition, you're always just kind of skimming the surface of something because you're the outsider. And if you really immerse yourself, then it stops being travel writing and starts being more like journalism or reportage. So I had not read Patrick Leigh Fermor before, but I was on vacation traveling and saw this book at a thrift store in their book room and had heard enough about him that I wanted to give it a shot. So it's the first book of a trilogy that he wrote about a trip that he took when he was 18 years old. He was kicked out of boarding school as a 17-year-old for flirting with a local girl. And rather than continuing his education there, he decided to become a writer. And when he was 18, he set out on foot to travel from Holland, the Netherlands, basically the mouth of the Rhine River, all the way across Europe to Constantinople in Istanbul. So down the Rhine, across the Alps, and then kind of southeast in the Danube Valley. And so this book, I'm maybe 100 pages into it, he's still in Germany there. This trip is all taking place between the world wars. He's 18 years old. He's in Germany in 1934. The Nazis have already come to power. One of the really fascinating things about this is the sense of history. I forget that the Nazis were really a force in Germany for much longer than you think. He's in Munich and he comes across a statue commemorating a 1923 skirmish that killed 6 Nazis. And you think, really, in 1923? There was this long, slow buildup to Hitler's rise. And Firmer is writing all of this while he's like 60, looking back on this trip. And so he's already a World War II hero, and he knows how it all comes out, but he forgets all that for the purposes of writing the book. He's gives you the Nazis in Germany, but he's not hinting at what will come, more just that there are presence there. And he's looking really for, the next beer.
I'm hanging on every word because this series of books, this trilogy, tugs at every single heartstring that I have, because it's all these things I love. It's travel writing. He's traveling by foot. It's the interwar period, which I find so interesting. And I also only read the middle volume of this series, Between the Woods and the Water. And I think I picked it up not only because of that time period. As a woman, it's not as easy to walk, across these countries and sleep wherever and do all of that safely. But Between the Woods and the Water also covers this sort of middle Europa area of the world that fascinates me. He goes through Transylvania, for example, where So I think I picked it up in my early 20s, and I never ended up reading the first or the third.
All the things that I worry about in travel writing are there. He is a bit of a dilettante, and he does have kind of this imperial attitude, but it's incredibly charming and enjoyable, partly because of those things. And he's motivated by genuine curiosity and just open-hearted generosity toward others and their culture, and a desire to learn more about the world without really judging or imposing. There is a fairly judgmental and very funny description of Germans at this Hofbrauhaus in Munich, where he talks about how fat they all are. And he writes in this very ornate kind of Gothic prose style. It's fancy, but just really compelling. In some ways, what he's writing about is the same thing the Beatniks did. He's a tramp, a hobo, but he's not doing it in the beatnik style at all. He's doing it in this fancy prose style it's more John McPhee than Tom Wolfe. Very learned, kind of autodidactic, and he's won me over. I think I will read the whole trilogy. John, what are you reading?
I'm reading a book because a friend recently picked it up, and I said, I should reread that so we can talk about it. And I say that to people probably 5 or 6 times a year. Let's do a little 2-person book club. And I almost literally never actually end up reading the book or having the book club. So I convinced myself this time to do it. It's a novel by Anita Bruckner, who I've raved about before on the podcast, but not for a while. This is a 1988 novel called Latecomers that I read probably 3 or so years ago. And luckily, because I have the memory of a goldfish, rereading is pleasurable for me because I don't remember much, even though I've underlined quite a bit in her books. This is an interesting novel because unlike the others of hers that I've read a handful of them, and I have a lot more to go. She was pretty prolific, even though she started relatively late in life. The ones that I have read tend to be very much within the consciousness or, surrounding the consciousness of a woman who is, as one person put it somewhere, suffocatingly sad, somewhat regretful, living a kind of spare life and psychologically analyzing the people around her and herself, even if it's in third person. This book is it has her style, it's very psychological, but it's primarily about 2 men who went from Germany during the war years to live with one of their aunts. And so the 2 men are named Hartman and Fibbage. They call themselves by their last names, and even their wives do, because they both are called Thomas. So they go by their last names, and they go into business together. They end up living in 2 flats in the same building with their wives. And so they're linked, essentially, as if they were brothers in a way throughout life after growing up in their school years with this aunt and of Hartman's. And really, the story goes back and forth between them. They're diametrically opposite people. Hartman is this sensualist who, when we first read about him, is lighting a cigarette and eating a chocolate and having a coffee and just sort of reveling in this moment. And Fibbage can't get over the past, and what happened to them as children. And Hartman is always telling him to let it go and to sort of live in the moment. And of course, he can't. And so it volleys between these two and between their wives. And it's all very subtle. But she's such a beautiful writer, and she can be very funny in a mordant way. There's this one part I was going to read where Fibbage has a son, and even in infancy, he's sort of intimidated by his son because the son has all of this energy, and he knows that the son is going to attack the world and not be like his father. And so this scene starts where it says, every day brought him a new toy, which, with a wide-armed gesture, he flung across the room. Fibbage felt these rejections keenly. Told to quieten the child down for the night, for Toto hated to sleep, Fibbage would pick up the toys with an air of apology for the way in which they had been treated, and try to rehabilitate them into his son's life. Here's a nice bear, he might say awkwardly. What is his name, I wonder? No answer would come. He thought he could see contempt in Toto's eye. I think his name is Teddy, he plowed gamely on. When still no answer was forthcoming, he would sigh and make as if to retreat. And then on the next page, he says, Toto seemed to present him with a task for which he had no preparation and for which he found himself permanently at a loss. He himself, innocent, submissive, felt so much more of a child than Toto, in whom he discerned the rudiments of an enormous will, as yet unspecific but striking in its authority. It was not merely that Toto possessed the rude health, the untrammeled energy that he himself had been denied. That surely was a matter for congratulation. What he sensed and what perturbed him was inaccessibility. They would never, he felt, understand one another, and without understanding, could each properly love the other?
Adverbs get a lot of grief, but she uses two of my favorites here, keenly and gamely.
Yes, those are two good adverbs. And I agree, adverbs mostly get a bad rap.
They do. I don't think fairly.
Well played.
Thank you.
What are you reading, Pamela?
I recently read a novel called The Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki. And I know that this novel has a lot of fans because I posted about it on Instagram and it was just everyone saying like, yes, of course, finally, what took you so long? I didn't end up picking this up until a copy was sent to me by the writer Robert Gottlieb, who recently wrote an essay for the book review on John Gunther. And he's a very widely read person, but especially he has a real interest in Japanese literature. And when I accidentally mentioned that, I hadn't read this, it just like a copy showed up in the mail, 2 days later. It's translated by Edward Siedensticker. The book it was published in 1957. Tanizaki wrote a number of novels, and I'm kind of interested in them. A few of them are described in the back. One of them has a title that just reels me right in called Diary of a Mad Old Man, which feels like something I would like. But this is the first book I've read by him. And it is the story of 4 women, daughters in their way, but the parents are dead, of a formerly well-to-do but declining upper middle class family in Osaka. And it takes place on the eve of World War II. And there are a few political references in the novel so that you get a real sense of time and place. But the primary concern of the book is about these 4 women and about their marriages. The 4 sisters are Tsuruko, Sachiko, Yukiko, and Teiko, and that's going in age order. So Tsuruko has already married. She has a number of small children. She and her husband, and the men really do take a kind of back seat in this book, but Tatsuo have taken on the role of the parents. They run what is referred to as the main house, and it's where the unmarried girls are supposed to, or women, none of them are girls anymore, are supposed to be living until they're married off. Sachiko is married, and she's the second oldest. They all live in Osaka, but sort of midway through the book, Tsuruku and her family moves to Tokyo. And a lot of the book is kind of about the difference between the Osaka way of life, Osaka and Kobe, and Tokyo, and how things are done there. So Sachiko has one child, a daughter, and the 2 younger sisters, Yukiko and Teiko, prefer to live with Sachiko than to live with Tsuruko. You kind of get the sense that Tsuruko is preoccupied with her children. Nobody likes her husband. Like, that's just not much fun. And everyone would rather be with Sachiko. And Sachiko is really the character that you see most of the events of the novel through her eyes. Yukiko remains somewhat of a mystery, as does Teiko, a little bit to a lesser extent Tsuruko. The main question lies in, when will Yukiko get married? So the deal is, as in, I guess, royal families, you're supposed to go in age order. So Tsuruko and Tachiko have been married off. Yukiko is stubbornly difficult to send off to a husband, and for a number of reasons. You never really understand what's entirely going on in Yukiko's mind, although she has a way of putting her foot down when she's not interested in someone in ways that can become really frustrating for the reader. And you feel frustrated because you're eager for her to get married. And there's a kind of ticking bomb in that Teiko, the younger sister, has been fooling around and getting into mischief while waiting for her turn to marry in ways that are sabotaging Yukiko's chances by putting the family name in a poor light. So it's this tension between, when will Yukiko get married and will it be too late? Will Teiko ruin her chances or bring the whole family down in some way before this can happen? And Yukiko is like at a terrible age, like in her early 30s, maybe, at which point it's become, dire. One of the interesting things in the novel, where it really becomes very page-turnery, is there's a huge flood that hits Kobe and Osaka, and it's so vivid. You can't put the book down. It felt so real and so specific that I looked it up after, and there was a real flood. The Times reported on it at the time. It was, one of the deadliest floods ever to hit Japan. And given our times of extreme weather, it's kind of interesting to read the account of that flood in this book and to look at the news coverage of it back then.
I went through a pretty intense phase of Japanese literature a couple of years ago, and I still follow the thread a bit here and there now. And that was one of the books that I bought during that phase because so many people highly recommended it, including Elida Becker, our esteemed former colleague, and now you, and now all the people on your Instagram. And I just see every time it gets mentioned that there's this sizable cult of affectionate readers for it. So, but it is big. It's a 600-page book that sprawls through the family. So it's intimidated me a bit.
It's not quite 600 pages. Take my copy, John. It's a deceptive, 520 something pages, but it goes pretty quickly. It's very accessible. It's definitely engrossing, and it's sort of weirdly, I find this is my version of escapist fiction, in that it really does send you back to a different time and place. And it was written in 1957, about the period before the war. And so I think there's a certain thread of nostalgia that runs through it, not entirely positive nostalgia for just this earlier age. And even in the period that Tanizaki is writing about, these women, this family, is kind of a throwback already. Already their way of life is very much being lost in Japan. And, there's signs of it all the time. When the sisters go out, there's sort of a long debate about which kimono to put on. And even then, you can sense that these very particulars of decorum are questions that most of Japan has kind of already put aside. This family is still carrying out all of these traditions and these
almost rituals.
These rituals that, in fact, are holding the family back.
All right, I'm moving it up.
Going up the queue.
It's moved up a few spots.
It sounds very much like Jane Austen in Japan.
It is. It did remind me a lot of Austen as I was reading it. All right, let's run down the titles again. Greg, what did you read?
A Time of Gifts by Patrick Lee Firmer.
I read Latecomers by Anita Bruckner.
And I read The Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.